So when disabled people are excluded and segregated, there must be an expectation that we will fight back.
Don't wait for the publication of the paper, then start the fight. The fight needs to happen now to try and influence what that document and what that policy looks like.
The white paper must apply the UNCRPD definition of inclusive education.
Our government ratified UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, which guarantees every disabled child a right to inclusive education.
Let's raise our voices. Let's raise our demands.
Coming together with one voice, one purpose for inclusive education for everyone as a human right. Before I begin, we need to centre access, because a movement for liberation means everyone must be able to take part. So when disabled people are excluded and segregated, there must be an expectation that we will fight back. That's why we're here tonight, to rally, to resist and demand an education system that respects, includes us and values us.
This is Human Rights Day, unfortunately commemorated by the government by announcing they want to reduce human rights as protected by the European Court of Human Rights. However, we are expecting a white paper next year on education, and we have got some good words about inclusive education from the government, but it's about backing those up with actions and a budget. It's also why we're advocating for an Inclusive Education Act rather than just leaving this to the goodwill of politicians. And to be very much based in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People.
I just want to say that given this event and the importance of recognising where we are today in terms of the struggle for inclusive education. Now, I've been the chairperson of ALLFIE, the Alliance for Inclusive Education, for more than 10 years. And I've seen an experience through the lived experiences of parents, supporting parents and young people to get access to mainstream education. And I've gradually seen from the 1990s to the early 2000s to the 2020s, where parents have steadily been in a combative mode for resources. And parents have been left high and dry. Some parents who can navigate the education system have fared fairly well in terms of accessing those resources. And some people have argued that this is based primarily on a neoliberal kind of a scarce resource, chasing finite resources, and bleeding money away from the mainstream education system. According to the Department for Education, there's approximately 1.6 million, this was in 2024, 1.6 million children who are said to have special educational needs and or disability. And 80% of them are in the mainstream. Although that 80%, the support is negative. I recently was reading a response from Georgia Gould, the education minister, about a question that was posed to her about a definition for inclusive education. Now, at ALLFIE, we've campaigned hard and long for the UK government, irrespective of the political colours, to make progressive realisation or progressive moves towards an inclusive education system. We've known that there's a long history of segregation of disabled people, and it's dire. There's a long debt being owed to disabled people on many fronts, and we've seen the brunt of abuse after abuse and assaults on disabled people on our own lives. And it's for this rallying call that we are cementing this idea. What we need to do is commit ourselves to the UN obligations, and the UN did state that it's concerned that we have a dual track system, even based on the premise of parental choice. This is a misnomer, and we really do need to fight to ensure that all children are accepted in a fully inclusive, supported mainstream education system.
For me, education is really a basic right that everybody should have. I'm an advocate for an inclusive education, not least due to my own lived experience. For those who don't know me, I've been a Member of Parliament for Battersea for the last 8 years, and I was born with a condition called nystagmus, which is an involuntary movement of the eye, and I'm registered severely sight impaired. Now, growing up, my mother chose to mainstream my education as long as I had the right support. But at primary school, the then head teacher felt that it would be necessary for me to be moved into a special school and didn't want me in her school. But thankfully, I had a mum who was not going to stand for any of that. And she fought not least just the school itself, but also the local education authority. We won our battle, and I was able to have a support worker, and I remained in mainstream primary school. Then when it came to my secondary school education, I went to a mainstream school that had a unit where I had a bit of extra support for things like science, home ec, technology, and so forth. And that was the right thing to do for somebody like myself. So my roots in having an inclusive education system run deep. It isn't just something now. Now, whilst I strongly believe that there is a space for special schools, I certainly don't think we should be building any more of them. And I certainly don't think they should be the default. The default, in my view, should always be mainstream with the right support. And for those that have severe or complex needs, then finding the right education setting is going to be best for those. Now, we know that the government are coming forward with their Send white paper. This is long overdue. And when I met with Michelle and the team last week, I said to them, what's going to be really important ahead of the publication of that white paper is to try and influence it as much as possible so that the government understand, what it means to have an inclusive education system. Having an inclusive education system, as we all know, it really does sit firm and central to the pillars within the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. I'm a strong advocate for the social model of disability and for that convention, because I believe when we became signatories to that convention back in 2009, the next stage should break that into domestic policy. That hasn't happened yet. So I have a job to do here as a Member of Parliament to keep advocating for that. But you as individuals and also as organisations that are led by and for deaf and disabled people, that is exactly what we should be doing. The white paper will be coming in the new year, so it's really going to be incumbent on everyone to work collectively to try and influence that. Don't wait for the publication of the paper, then start the fight. The fight needs to happen now to try and influence what that document and what that policy looks like.
Hello, my name is Richard Reeser and I'm from World of Inclusion. My background is as a disabled person, activist, teacher and champion of inclusion, both in the UK and around the world. I think the issue that lies at the heart of the white paper and what it should and probably won't address is how we view special educational needs and disability, SEND as it is called under the Act. What do we need to do in this white paper? We already have the solutions in the Equalities Act of 2010, but they're not being implemented and they're not being policed. Under the Equality Act, all children or adults who are disabled are identified, and that would apply to all those children whose needs are additional or different to that which is normally provided in an ordinary school, which is the definition of SEND, both for those with a plan and those who just have it at a school level. In other words, they all count as disabled under the Equalities Act. There is a duty to them, an anticipatory duty, to remove barriers with reasonable accommodations and reasonable adjustments, both in school policies, but also in their particular situations. So one of the things that we would be looking for is to remove the restriction on schools not being able to become fully inclusive as a matter of law, removing physical barriers, which at the moment they don't have to do. So I think that would be one thing that we would need to do. Another would be to police the Equality Act and to make sure that schools which are discriminating are first of all warned, are trained, and then actually fined if that happens. That the league tables that we spend a lot of time poring over, which are very detrimental, should be focusing on all the children and the progress that they make individually rather than a normative approach. If the white paper were just to do those three things, we would make real progress. Thank you.
We are currently facing doubling number of disabled children entering into the psychiatric system as a result of ongoing segregated education in its various guises. For many disabled children, their mental health is at risk as a result of rising regimentation within our education system, i.e. behaviour policies, uniform policies, sensory environments, teaching methods, and the pressure of high-stake examinations. So increasingly, we are finding that our education system is failing in bracing children's well-being, bracing mental health. This often results to what I might call the school to prison or psychiatric system pipeline, where children start off with where children's behaviour is undiagnosed as being related to their autism or learning disabilities, learning difficulties, or mental health, where they are seen as being naughty children and are treated as such. So a lot of these children end up having behaviour warnings, they end up in detention, isolation booths or rooms, exclusions, alternative provision in segregated schools, and then they make their journey right into the psychiatric units. Many children experience attack on personal integrity, subjected to abuse and inhumane treatment that can often lead to deaths in such dire situations. The white paper itself focuses on having SEND units. This is another form of internal segregation, and we don't believe that this will work whatsoever. The white paper will bring us back to pre-Warnock days, where more and more children will end up being segregated, but within the mainstream school setting and within and outside. So, what needs to change is as follows. The school's white paper is meant to be focused on promoting inclusive education, replacing individual education healthcare plans with SEND units will increase segregation. So we need to get back to ensuring
30 seconds to wrap up.
Children's well-being is at the centre of everything that we do. We need to look at what is inclusive education, the principles of inclusive education. So looking to ALLFIE's manifesto and co-production, I think was Tracy had said. Children must retain their rights to assessments and provision needed within mainstream education system. And we need schools that focus on children's well-being, on children's mental health, and feeling like there is a sense of belonging, so that children feel that they're able to develop and be accepted within the education system, and therefore straight after. Because at the end of the day, children who are educated within mainstream settings, that learn to play, that play together, learn together, relate together, and work together, will create an inclusive society.
At ALLFIE, we believe the current government's use of the term mainstream inclusivity is not inclusive at all. In fact, it is oppressive. There is a lack of clarity around the term. One point it does not address is how many disabled young people will end up in units within mainstream schools, being taught in separate classes away from their non-disabled peers. Another issue is that is not being tackled is the harm and torture that takes place in many SEN units through force and restraint being used on young disabled people to manage their behavior. We want the upcoming white paper to address this confusion around the definition of inclusive education. My call to action is that the white paper must apply the UNCRPD definition of inclusive education. Article 24 of the UNCRPD says that disabled people should not be excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability, and that disabled people have a right to an inclusive education system at all levels. Language is powerful and it has real life consequences for disabled people. Following Edmore and Michelle's meeting with Marsha D. Cordova MP, Marsha asked the Secretary of State for Education what definition of inclusive education her department uses. Georgia Gold MP responded with a waffling and confusing definition that avoided specific detail. This was yet more deflection and delay. The government needs to recognize the education of disabled children and young people as a human rights priority. They need to focus on building a fully inclusive education system instead of creating new and unhelpful buzzwords around inclusive education. They must act now. Remember to join our young people's movement.
One thing that I actually wanted to bring up was the campaign and the white paper at the moment. In terms of access to education at the moment, it is poor. With EHCPs at the moment, I feel like they're really beneficial in providing support, but actually it can lead to segregation of deaf and disabled people, specifically from mainstream education. And a lot of deaf and disabled people aren't actually able to get adequate support. I was actually really lucky. I'm going to university, I'm studying law, which is really fantastic. But I've had to really fight for myself, and my parents had to fight for myself for years to be in a mainstream school and to make sure that I was able to get an adequate education. But at that time, you know, we need to make sure everyone is able to get the same support. And we need to make sure disabled people have their rights to access proper education and proper support. They shouldn't have a different curriculum and things like that. But I understand the situation at the moment. You know, it's the same for different people. There's lots of different units within education. And the quality of education for some students is significantly lower than others, which means that they can't then access university, which is a shame, really. And I myself was really lucky with, you know, my own educational journey. But one reason is that they promise various things and then they can't actually deliver that. They say we can do this, that, and the other, but they don't actually show that with what they do with the access to education. And also support is often quite basic. The quality is much lower, as I said earlier. For example, for communication support workers for deaf people, you know, schools normally set up support, but their level of sign language qualification is significantly low. Really, they should have a level 6 qualification, but sometimes they in fact only have a level 2. So that means that people don't have the same access to language. And so that just means that, you know, that then there are additional barriers that deaf people are facing to education. And so then if you're thinking about getting a job in the future, it's more challenging. And it's also like the equivalent is that having an English teacher only qualified to level 2. And, you know, we have these are the rights that we need to ensure that are in place. And we have the right to have an equal life and an equal education. And the support at the moment, you know, I'm unapologetically, I do not believe that an insufficiently qualified person should do a job that requires a high level of professionalism and specialist training.
My first court case was about suing a school for refusing to accept a child with Down syndrome, and how everyone was blaming this child for not being like all children should be, and how we actually won and forced everyone to look at things very differently. So today we know the government is funding special schools, is cutting support for disabled children and blaming us for it. Then young people grow up struggling through school without support and then struggling to find jobs. They blame us again, well, young people, for not finding jobs. So we know we need very radical change. We need inclusive education because those of us who survived special schools, we know when you go to special school, be it special building, special unit, special room, we know you're different. You don't belong. We know you're not accepted. And that thought stays with many for life. We say inclusive education is good for everyone. It's not just for disabled children, because when resources go to mainstream schools to make them better for everyone, to make them able to support every child, no matter what their barriers are to flourish and do the best they can. This is education I'm sure we would all have wanted, and we would be happily sending our children to schools like this. We know inclusive education is not just something that works, it's our right, and we demand it as our right because, as it was said before, our government ratified UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, which guarantees every disabled child a right to inclusive education. And let's be clear, when we talk about education, it's not just about math, reading, writing, or passing tests. It is about growing up as a human being, about
30
building
seconds to wrap up.
relationships and learning to live in this society. So what kind of society are we building when we segregate? It's society that we have now, society that treats many of us as second class. We know we need to change this. And we also know that when we as disabled people stood together, we could win. We fought for Disability Discrimination Act, for changes to direct payments. We fought against benefits cuts. So it is important now we stand together and push and force the government to move from segregation to inclusion.
I want to focus on one area, which is a growing worry that I have, which is the increasing number of resource provisions and units that are already being set up in local areas now before the school's white paper is even released. So I think this is telling us the direction of travel is already fixed. I went today to one of the online conversation events that are being hosted by the Department for Education and the Minister, Georgia Gould. And today was about the principle of local. What does it mean for local as a principle for SEND reforms? Now, we weren't asked at all, and in fact, it wasn't covered in the discussion really at all, about how do we make mainstream classrooms more inclusive. But instead, we were shown two glossy, I assume produced by the Department for Education, videos promoting the benefits of resource provision and separate provision for children with special educational needs. And also there were online quizzes and discussions which were about the benefits of resource provision. Now, obviously, as we know, inclusion isn't about creating separate places inside mainstream schools, but we want to ensure that children are able to learn alongside their peers, build friendships, and participate fully in every aspect of the school life in the same classrooms. I remember when my daughter was due to start secondary school, so we're talking probably about 11 years ago, the local authority insisted that I went and visited a school with a resource provision for moderate learning disabilities before they would name the local mainstream school that we wanted in her EHCP. We went and visited I went with a friend, and we were taken down a separate corridor to a different part of the school from all of the other children. We went into one of the classrooms and the windows were set high. The children couldn't even see out of the classroom through the windows, and they were colouring. It was alphabet letters. We were shown around the rest of the school. We were taken to the bottom of a stairwell, and the person showing us around told us that if we looked up that stairwell, that was the maths department, but we didn't need to go up and have a look at it because our children would never be in there. They also said time then our children could invite their friends back into the resource provision space, but that rarely happened because the children didn't have friends in the rest of the school. I think that what we're seeing, this pattern is also already existing in post 16. My daughter now is in college, and the only option available for her once she left mainstream education at 16 was either specialist provision or within a mainstream college to go into foundation or life skills courses, which are de facto units because they are separate provision in separate parts of the college. So I think that we need to, as Marsha said earlier, be contacting MPs and speaking out about this now, because we need to protect the right to inclusive mainstream education, and really be challenging right now this direction of travel around resource provisions and units.
So hello there. So I am David Buxton. I'm the CEO of Disability Action. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there today. So the topic that I'd like to talk about, so the deaf people's rights to education. What does this really mean to me and myself and the people in my community? It's different to what I experienced in my time growing up, and at that time there was 90% of the deaf community that there was a special school, a deaf school, and now it's the complete opposite. It's now 90% of deaf children and young people that go into the mainstream schooling system. And inclusive education, that means that their rights. So I just have two examples, two very brief examples for 2-3 minutes. So the first point is that deaf people,
do you want to get yourself
they cope. Say, you know, if they sit at the front, that's inclusion, that's impossible, that's accessibility. But is that a reality that they're able to access? No. Obviously they lip read. There's about 70% of things they cannot attain from lip reading. So what is their right? It's very important for us to campaign for inclusion. And how can you do this? You have to make sure that the broader schooling system includes sign language into their curriculum and their education. So this for social, emotional support and cohesion, making friends, having inclusion, feeling valued, having equity. So you've been, you know, learning French, Spanish, German, GCSEs, and now obviously there's now a BSL GCSE, and you get an A star, something for these German languages and Spanish and French languages. And you know, after school, do you remember French? No, it's a waste of money. So this is why I'm challenging this and having sign language included in curriculum. So this means this helps the deaf community with work and social cohesion. And the second point and the concern that I have is to solve the problem of communication support workers, CSWs for short, providing support and assistance. They have level 1, level 2 sign language, which is okay, but the deaf community, they have a very strong language, and this means communication support workers do not understand that. Because their understanding of language is too low, and this fails the deaf students. So, and with deaf children and young people, their basic, the sort of basic standard that we need is really a level 4 qualified communication support worker, and this is the sort of thing we need to advocate for. And young deaf children and young people, they need the rights to their language and have language inclusion into their education. So I can't, you know, and that is the answer to everything really. That is inclusion. That is the language inclusion.
Human rights are not theoretical. They must be lived, defended, and demanded. Inclusive education is a human right. When a disabled child or young person is put out of mainstream education or placed in a segregated provision such as a unit, that right isn't being met. Also, when a disabled child or young person is denied the support they require in order to access education in a mainstream setting, that right isn't being fully met. We are here today because disabled children and young people are being fed by a system that chooses exclusion over justice and right. And we say enough. We demand an immediate end to the relentless expansion of segregated schools and some units. The government talks of inclusion, yet poured public money into segregation. This is not inclusion. This is segregation. We demand an end to the cynical delays to the schools, paper to the same reform. These delays are not bureaucratic. They are political choices that steal future silent voices and sacrifice disabled children and young people for government convenience. Finally, we demand that the UK government honor its obligation under the UN CRPD. Saying the convention then systematically ignored this convention. The government claims it's committed to protecting our human rights, yet breaks them every single day. So on this Human Rights Day, we say, we will not stay quiet, we will not be polite, we will not stop. Inclusive education is not a favor, it is a right, and rights are not given. They are taken back through struggle, solidarity, and collective power. Let's raise our voices. Let's raise our demands.
It was loud and clear tonight. The messages were clear. Disabled people are not the problem. Exclusion of disabled pupils and students from mainstream education is a denial of their rights. Segregation is the problem. Overlooking our intersectional experiences and uniqueness is an injustice. Inaccessible systems are the problem. Language on inclusive education must embody the values and principles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. Policies that deny our rights, such as the continued justification for expanding units and building segregated schools and colleges, reinforce hatred, discrimination, and a divided society. The white paper must abolish the systemic oppression that shuts disabled children out of our mainstream education. The ways in which the education system operates is failing disabled people, which is why we need an Inclusive Education Act.
Well, I noticed as well all the way through strong focus on demanding our rights, which is essential. And I think the one thing that we all have to be doing now, we need to be movement building, because politicians are not going to do this because they're nice people or evil people or whatever. They do it if they're made to do it by a movement. So we need to build that movement. And one thing we can all easily do after tonight is, when there is another rally that ALLFIE puts on, which everyone brings one more person to it. Okay? So I want everyone to commit to that. Everybody brings one more person to the rally. And that is how you start to build the movement, a movement which politicians cannot then ignore.
So if you leave the rally fired up, that's exactly what we want you to do. We want you to be fired up because we need you to be. It has to be. It's a must. And how do you get involved? Become ALLFIE's member, join our movement and strengthen our collective voice. Support our campaign on the white paper on SEND reform. We must make it impossible for the government to ignore us when we say, educate, don't segregate. Share our report for an Inclusive Education Act. That must happen. And also, I just really want to just close by saying a huge thanks to all of you, the audience, all the speakers, all of ALLFIE's staff, our BSO interpreters, and of course, my co-chair, Rick, badass, excellent. But also want to just say, closing last words from a chapter in the book, Incurably Human, by ALLFIE's founder, Micheline Mason, who joined the Ancestors last year. The 3 words carry decades of truth and struggles with them. Exclusion harms everybody. We say, educate, don't segregate. Can we just blow up the screen with lots of emojis? Just make some noise with mojos, whatever, on the screen. One love and solidarity, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the night. Thank you.